Tommy Tuberville was blocked from his own event. The guard kneeled after learning who he was. The humid Alabama air hung heavy over the sprawling campus of Auburn University as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The crisp October evening carried with it the familiar sounds of college life, students chatting animatedly as they hurried between buildings, the distant hum of traffic on College Street, and the ever-present buzz of excitement that seemed to permeate the very atmosphere of this storied institution. Marcus Washington adjusted his security uniform for what felt like the 100th time that evening, his weathered hands smoothing down the pressed fabric as he stood at his post outside the gleaming entrance to the Jordan-Hare Stadium's VIP hospitality suite. At 62 years old, Marcus had seen his fair share of events during his 15 years working campus security, but tonight felt different. Tonight was special. The Celebrating Auburn Legends Gala was set to begin in less than an hour, and Marcus could feel the anticipation building like electricity in the air. Distinguished alumni, former coaches, and local dignitaries would soon be arriving to honor the university's most celebrated figures in sports and academics. The event had been months in the planning, with tickets selling out within hours of being released to the public. Marcus took pride in his work, especially on nights like this. He had grown up just 20 miles from campus in the small town of Opelika, dreaming of one day walking these very halls as a student. Life had taken him down a different path: military service, a brief stint in law enforcement, and eventually settling into his current role, but he had never lost his deep respect and admiration for Auburn University and everything it represented. The guest list for tonight's event read like a who's who of Auburn royalty. Charles Barkley was expected to make an appearance, along with several former SEC championship team members and a handful of successful business leaders who had graduated from the university over the decades. Marcus had been specifically assigned to the main entrance, a position of trust that he didn't take lightly. As he stood at his post, Marcus noticed a figure approaching from the parking lot, walking with a slightly hurried pace. The man appeared to be in his late 60s, dressed in a well-tailored navy blue suit that spoke of quality and attention to detail. There was something familiar about his bearing, the confident way he carried himself, but Marcus couldn't quite place him in the dim evening light. The stranger approached the entrance, reaching into his jacket pocket as he walked. Marcus straightened his posture and prepared to check the man's credentials, as he had been instructed to do for every single person entering the facility, regardless of their apparent status or familiarity. "Good evening, sir," Marcus said with professional courtesy, his voice carrying the slight southern drawl that he had never quite shaken, despite years of trying to sound more formal in his security role. "I'll need to see your invitation and some form of identification, please." The man paused, a look of mild surprise crossing his features. He was closer now, and Marcus could see that he had the weathered face of someone who had spent considerable time outdoors, with silver-gray hair that was immaculately styled despite the humidity. There was something about his eyes, a sharpness, an intensity that spoke of years spent in high-pressure situations. "I'm sorry?" the man replied, his voice carrying a slight accent that Marcus couldn't immediately identify. "I think there might be some confusion here." Marcus maintained his professional demeanor, though he could sense a slight tension beginning to build in the interaction. This wasn't unusual. Many important people seemed to expect special treatment, assuming that their status would precede them. But Marcus had learned over the years that consistency was key to maintaining security, and he treated every person the same way, regardless of their apparent importance. "No confusion at all, sir," Marcus replied evenly. "This is a private event, and I need to verify that you're on the guest list. It's standard procedure. Just need to see that invitation and an ID, and we'll get you right inside." The man's expression shifted slightly, a mixture of amusement and something that might have been respect flickering across his features. He reached into his jacket pocket again, this time more deliberately, and withdrew what appeared to be an invitation on heavy cardstock paper. "I'm afraid I might have forgotten to bring a physical invitation," the man said, holding up his empty hands with a slight smile. "You see, I was actually supposed to be one of the honored guests tonight. The name is Tommy Tuberville." Marcus felt a slight jolt of recognition at the name, but he couldn't quite place why it seemed familiar. He'd heard it before, certainly, but in what context? The man stood patiently, seemingly unperturbed by the delay, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that suggested military training or perhaps coaching experience. "Mr. Tuberville," Marcus said, pulling out his clipboard and scanning the guest list. "Let me just check our records here." As he ran his finger down the alphabetized list of names, Marcus found himself increasingly puzzled. There were several Turners, a few Tuckers, but no Tuberville to be found anywhere on the official guest roster. He double-checked, even looking at the VIP section reserved for the evening's honorees, but came up empty-handed. "Sir, I'm not seeing your name on tonight's guest list," Marcus said, looking up from his clipboard with genuine concern. "Are you certain you have the right event? This is the Auburn Legends Gala, scheduled for October 15th. Tommy's eyebrows raised slightly, and for the first time, Marcus detected a hint of frustration in his expression. But rather than becoming argumentative or demanding special treatment, as many people might have in similar circumstances, Tommy seemed to take the situation in stride. "Well, that's interesting," Tommy said, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "I received a call from the University Athletics Department just 3 days ago, confirming my attendance and asking about dietary restrictions for the dinner portion." Marcus felt himself caught in an increasingly awkward situation. The man seemed genuine, and there was something about his demeanor that suggested he was telling the truth. But Marcus had his instructions, and more importantly, he had his integrity. He couldn't simply allow someone to enter a secure event without proper verification, regardless of how convincing they might seem. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Tuberville," Marcus said carefully, "but I'm sure you can appreciate that I have to follow security protocols. Is there perhaps someone inside who could verify your invitation? Maybe someone from the athletics department you could call?" Tommy nodded, apparently appreciating Marcus's professional approach to the situation. He pulled out his cell phone, a newer model that he handled with the slightly uncertain manner of someone who had adapted to modern technology later in life. "Let me try calling Jim Patterson. He's the one who invited me," Tommy said, scrolling through his contacts. "He should be able to clear this up quickly." As Tommy made his call, Marcus found himself studying the man more carefully. There was definitely something familiar about him, something that nagged at the back of his mind, like a half-remembered song. The way he carried himself spoke of leadership experience, and his accent, now that Marcus was paying closer attention, had the distinctive cadence of someone who had spent time in multiple regions of the South. The call seemed to go straight to voicemail, and Tommy left a brief message explaining his situation. He tried 2 more numbers with similar results, his expression growing more puzzled with each failed attempt. "Technology," Tommy said with a rueful smile, holding up his phone. "Sometimes I miss the days when you could just walk up and talk to people face to face." Marcus found himself warming to the man, despite the unusual circumstances. There was something refreshingly down-to-earth about his response to what could have been a very embarrassing situation. Rather than demanding to speak to a supervisor or threatening consequences, Tommy seemed genuinely amused by the mix-up. "Tell you what," Marcus said, making a decision that went slightly against protocol, but felt right given the circumstances. "Why don't I call my supervisor and see if we can get this sorted out? He might have an updated guest list or know something I don't." As Marcus reached for his radio to contact his supervisor, The sound of approaching footsteps caught his attention. A small group of well-dressed individuals was walking toward the entrance, their animated conversation and expensive attire marking them clearly as invited guests. Among them was a woman Marcus recognized, Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the university's Vice President of Alumni Relations. She was a frequent presence at events like this, and Marcus had interacted with her numerous times over the years. If anyone could help resolve this situation, it would be her. "Dr. Hendricks," Marcus called out as the group approached, "could I speak with you for just a moment?" Patricia excused herself from her group and walked over, her professional smile firmly in place. She was a woman in her early 50s, with the kind of polished appearance and confident bearing that came from years of navigating university politics and donor relations. "Good evening, Marcus," she said warmly. "Everything going smoothly tonight?" "Well, mostly," Marcus replied, gesturing toward Tommy. "This gentleman says he was invited to tonight's event, but I'm not finding his name on the official guest list. He says he spoke with someone from athletics about attending." Patricia turned toward Tommy, and Marcus watched as her expression underwent a remarkable transformation. Her professional smile faltered for just a moment, replaced by a look of confusion, then recognition, and finally what appeared to be barely concealed panic. "Oh my goodness," she said, her voice dropping to nearly a whisper. "Coach Tuberville." The title hit Marcus like a physical blow. Coach Tuberville. Suddenly, the pieces began falling into place with devastating clarity. Tommy Tuberville. Not just any Tommy Tuberville, but Coach Tommy Tuberville, the legendary Auburn football coach who had led the Tigers to their historic undefeated season in 2004, who had achieved what many considered impossible by going undefeated in SEC play, who had been the architect of one of the most memorable eras in Auburn football history. Marcus felt his stomach drop as the full magnitude of his mistake became clear. He'd been stopping Auburn royalty from entering an event held in honor of Auburn legends. The irony was almost too much to bear. "Dr. Hendricks," Tommy said with characteristic grace, extending his hand. "Good to see you again. I believe there might be some confusion about tonight's event." Patricia shook his hand, her face flushed with embarrassment as she glanced between Tommy and Marcus. "Coach, I am so sorry about this. There's been a terrible mix-up with the guest list. You were supposed to be one of our featured honorees tonight." Marcus stood frozen, his clipboard suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He had spent 15 years working security at Auburn University, had prided himself on his professionalism and attention to detail, and now he had committed what felt like the ultimate breach of Auburn protocol. He had turned away a legend. "It's quite all right," Tommy said, and Marcus was struck by the genuine warmth in his voice. "Mistakes happen, though I have to say this young man here was just doing his job and doing it well. I respect that." The praise felt like salt in a wound to Marcus. Here was a man who had every right to be furious, who had been embarrassed and delayed by a security guard who should have recognized him immediately, and he was offering compliments rather than complaints. "Coach," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper, I should have known. I'm so sorry." Tommy turned to face Marcus fully, and for the first time that evening, Marcus saw the intensity that had made this man a successful coach at the highest levels of college football. But rather than anger or disappointment, Tommy's expression held something unexpected, understanding. "Son," Tommy said, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder, "you did exactly what you were supposed to do. You checked every person who came to this entrance, you followed your protocols, and you treated everyone with respect. That's exactly the kind of integrity and consistency that makes for good security work." Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion he hadn't expected. He'd been prepared for anger, for complaints to his supervisor, for potential disciplinary action. He had not been prepared for kindness and understanding from the man he had wronged. "But coach," Marcus said, struggling to find the right words, You're Coach Tuberville. You shouldn't have had to go through that. You're Auburn royalty." Tommy's expression softened even further, and Marcus caught a glimpse of the man behind the legend, someone who understood what it meant to work hard, to take pride in doing a job well, regardless of how glamorous or visible that job might be. "Marcus," Tommy said, having caught the name from Patricia's earlier greeting, "let me tell you something. The fact that you didn't recognize me, that you treated me just like everyone else, that tells me this university hired the right person for this job. Auburn's not about special treatment or cutting corners. It's about doing things the right way, every time, Doctor." Hendricks had been watching this exchange with growing amazement, and Marcus could see her expression shifting from embarrassment to something approaching admiration. She had clearly expected a very different reaction from the coach. "Coach Tuberville is absolutely right," she said, addressing Marcus directly. "You handled this situation exactly as you should have. The error was entirely on our end. Somehow Coach's name was left off the official guest list, even though he was confirmed as one of our honorees." Tommy nodded in agreement. "Patricia, these things happen. Systems break down. Communications get crossed. What matters is how we handle it when things don't go according to plan." Marcus felt a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the humid Alabama evening. Here was a man who could have demanded apologies, who could have made a scene, who could have gotten Marcus in serious trouble with a single phone call. Instead, he had chosen to use the situation as a teaching moment to demonstrate the very values that Auburn claimed to represent. "Now," Tommy said, clapping his hands together with renewed energy, "I believe there's a party going on inside, and I'm told there might be some people who'd like to say hello." As the small group began moving toward the entrance, Marcus stepped forward once more, but this time his posture was different. Rather than the rigid stance of a security guard checking credentials, he carried himself with the bearing of someone offering a gesture of respect. To everyone's surprise, Marcus slowly lowered himself to one knee, his head bowed in a gesture of profound respect and recognition. The simple movement carried with it all the emotion of the past 15 minutes, the embarrassment of his mistake, the admiration for Tommy's grace under pressure, and the deep respect for what this man had meant to Auburn University and its community. The gesture was spontaneous, unrehearsed, and all the more powerful for its authenticity. In that moment, Marcus wasn't just a security guard acknowledging a mistake. He was an Auburn fan, a member of the Auburn family, paying tribute to one of the men who had helped make the university what it was. Tommy looked down at Marcus with an expression of genuine surprise and deep emotion. For a man who had received countless accolades, awards, and honors throughout his coaching career, this simple, heartfelt gesture from a security guard seemed to touch him in a way that formal recognition never could. "Marcus," Tommy said softly, "please stand up. You don't need to kneel for me." But Marcus remained in position for a moment longer, wanting to make sure his message was clear. When he finally rose to his feet, his eyes were bright with unshed tears, and his voice was strong with conviction. "Coach," he said, "it was an honor to meet you tonight, even if I didn't handle it the way I should have at first. Welcome to your event." The grand ballroom of the Auburn University Alumni Center had been transformed into a showcase of tiger pride, with orange and blue decorations creating an atmosphere that was both elegant and unmistakably Auburn. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over round tables draped in crisp white linens, each centerpiece featuring a small replica of the university's iconic Samford Tower, surrounded by fresh flowers in Auburn's signature colors. Tommy Tuberville paused just inside the entrance, taking in the scene before him. The room buzzed with the kind of energy that only comes when Auburn people gather together. Animated conversations, bursts of laughter, and the underlying current of shared pride that binds the Auburn family together across generations and geographical boundaries. Dr. Patricia Hendricks stood beside him, still visibly shaken by the earlier incident at the security checkpoint. She had spent the walk from the stadium entrance apologizing profusely, explaining how the miscommunication had occurred and outlining the steps she was taking to ensure such mistakes never happened again. "Coach, I really cannot express how sorry I am about what happened," she said for what Tommy estimated was the 8th or 9th time in the past 10 minutes. "Marcus is actually one of our most reliable security staff members. He's been with us for 15 years, and this kind of thing just doesn't happen." Tommy placed a gentle hand on her arm, interrupting what he could see was becoming an increasingly anxious spiral of apologies. "Patricia, please. I meant what I said out there. That young man was doing exactly what he was supposed to do. If anything, it shows me that Auburn takes security seriously and hires people with integrity." As they stood talking, Tommy became aware of a subtle shift in the room's energy. Conversations were quieting slightly, and he could feel eyes turning in his direction. It was a familiar sensation from his coaching days, that moment when people begin to recognize a notable presence in their midst. The first person to approach was Dr. James Mitchell, the university's athletic director, a man Tommy had worked with during the later years of his coaching tenure at Auburn. Jim's face lit up with genuine pleasure as he spotted Tommy, and he quickly made his way across the room with the determined stride of someone who had urgent business to attend to. "Tommy!" Jim called out, his voice carrying easily across the ambient noise of the gathering. "There you are. I was starting to worry when Patricia said there'd been some kind of mix-up at the entrance." The handshake between the two men carried the weight of shared history, the triumphs and challenges they had navigated together during some of Auburn football's most memorable seasons. Jim's grip was firm, and his smile was the kind that reaches all the way to the eyes, speaking of genuine affection and respect. "Jim, good to see you," Tommy replied warmly. "Though I have to say, your security team is top-notch. They weren't about to let anyone in here without proper credentials, not even someone claiming to be an old coach." Jim's expression shifted to one of concern mixed with curiosity. "What exactly happened out there?" Dr. Hendricks began to recount the story, but Tommy waved her off with good humor. "Nothing worth dwelling on. Let's just say your security guard Marcus takes his job seriously, and that's exactly what you want in someone protecting events like this." As word of Tommy's arrival spread through the room, a small crowd began to form around their group. Former players, university administrators, local business leaders, and longtime Auburn supporters all gravitated toward the man who had brought them some of their most cherished football memories. Among the first to reach them was William Big Cat Thompson, a former offensive lineman who had played under Tommy during the magical 2004 season. Big Cat had earned his nickname honestly. He stood 6'5" and had maintained most of his playing weight even 15 years after graduation, but his size was matched by his gentle demeanor and infectious smile. "Coach T!" Big Cat boomed, his voice carrying the kind of enthusiasm that made everyone within earshot smile. "Man, it's good to see you. You know, I was just telling my kids about that Iron Bowl in '04, about how you had us believing we could beat anybody, anywhere, anytime." Tommy's face lit up with the special warmth reserved for interactions with former players. These relationships were among the most meaningful aspects of his coaching career. Young men he had helped guide through some of the most formative years of their lives, who had gone on to become successful adults, loving fathers, and contributing members of their communities. "Big Cat," Tommy said, reaching up to clasp the much taller man on the shoulder. "How's the family? I heard you started your own construction company." "Yes, sir, 5 years now," Big Cat replied with obvious pride. "Got 12 employees and business is good. But Coach, I got to tell you, everything I learned about leadership, about not giving up when things get tough, about being accountable to your team, I learned that from you." These were the moments that made all the long hours, all the pressure, all the criticism worth it for Tommy. Coaching had never been just about winning games, though that was certainly important. It was about helping young people develop into the kind of adults who could make a positive difference in the world. As the crowd around Tommy continued to grow, Dr. Hendricks excused herself to attend to other hosting duties, but not before making sure Tommy was comfortable and had everything he needed. The athletic director, Jim Mitchell, remained close by, clearly enjoying the opportunity to witness the affection and respect Tommy commanded from the Auburn community. "Coach," came a voice from the edge of the growing circle, "could I have just a moment?" The voice belonged to Sarah Chen, a young woman in her late 20s who worked as a development officer for the university. She approached with the kind of purposeful confidence that suggested she had something important to say, but also with the slight nervousness that comes from addressing a personal hero. "Of course," Tommy said, turning his full attention to her with the same focus he had once given to game film study. "What can I do for you?" Sarah took a slight breath before speaking, as if gathering courage for what she was about to say. "Coach, I wanted to thank you, not just for what you did for Auburn football, but for what you taught me about perseverance." Tommy's eyebrows raised slightly in curiosity. He received thanks regularly from former players, but it was less common for someone he didn't immediately recognize to express such personal gratitude. "I was a student here during your final season," Sarah continued. "I was struggling academically, dealing with some family issues, and honestly thinking about dropping out. I used to study late in the library, and sometimes I'd see you walking across campus at night, coming back from the football offices." Tommy nodded, remembering those long nights during difficult seasons when the weight of expectations and the reality of challenging circumstances made sleep elusive. "One night, I was sitting outside the library crying because I'd just bombed another test, and you happened to walk by," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger as she continued. "You stopped, asked if I was okay, and when I told you I was thinking about quitting school, you sat down right there on that bench and talked to me for 20 minutes. The memory was coming back to Tommy now. A young woman, clearly distressed, sitting alone on a campus bench on a cold February evening. He remembered the conversation, though he hadn't known her name or her specific circumstances beyond what she had shared in that moment. "You told me that Auburn doesn't give up on its people, and that sometimes the most important victories come after the most difficult defeats," Sarah continued. "You said that if I could find one thing I was passionate about, one reason to keep going, that would be enough to build on." Tommy felt a familiar tightness in his throat. These encounters, brief moments of human connection that he often forgot about soon after they occurred, sometimes had profound impacts that he never knew about until years later. "I changed my major the next week," Sarah said, smiling now. "Started focusing on development and fundraising because I wanted to help other students who were struggling like I was. I've been working here for 4 years now, and every time I talk to a student who's thinking about giving up, I remember what you taught me about finding that one thing worth fighting for." The circle of people around them had grown quiet as Sarah told her story, and Tommy could see that her words were having an impact beyond just their intended recipient. This was what Auburn was really about. Not just football victories or academic achievements, but the ways in which people supported and lifted each other up during difficult times. "Sarah," Tommy said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine emotion, "thank you for sharing that with me, and thank you for the work you're doing here. Helping students find their path, helping them believe in themselves, that's some of the most important work anyone can do." Udilm. As Sarah stepped back into the circle with tears in her eyes and a smile on her face, Tommy found himself reflecting on the unexpected directions life could take. When he had stopped to talk to a distressed student on a cold February evening, he had simply been responding to his instincts as an educator and mentor. He had never imagined that brief conversation would influence someone's entire career path and, through that, impact countless other students. The crowd around Tommy continued to grow as the evening progressed, with people sharing memories, expressing gratitude, and simply enjoying the opportunity to be in the presence of someone who had played such a significant role in Auburn's history. But Tommy was struck by how many of the stories had nothing to do with football at all. There was Robert Martinez, now a successful attorney in Birmingham, who talked about how Tommy's emphasis on academic achievement had motivated him to take his studies more seriously. There was Janet Williams, a teacher who had been inspired by Tommy's post-game interviews about the importance of education. And there was Marcus's cousin, David Washington, who worked in the university's maintenance department and had been encouraged by Tommy's reputation for treating all members of the Auburn family with equal respect. As Tommy listened to these stories, he became increasingly aware of something that had been nagging at the back of his mind since the encounter with Marcus at the entrance. The security guard's reaction, his genuine remorse, his professional dignity, and especially that spontaneous gesture of respect, had touched something deep within Tommy that he was still trying to understand. "Excuse me, Coach," came a voice from behind him. Tommy turned to see Marcus approaching, no longer in his security uniform, but dressed in a simple but well-pressed suit that suggested this was his best formal attire. His posture was different too, less rigid than it had been at his post, but still carrying himself with the quiet dignity that Tommy had noticed earlier. The conversations around them gradually quieted as people noticed Marcus's approach. Word of the earlier incident had spread through the gathering, and there was a sense of curiosity about how this reunion would unfold. "Marcus," Tommy said warmly, extending his hand, "I'm glad you could join us inside. Are you off duty now?" Marcus shook Tommy's hand, his grip firm but not overly forceful, the handshake of a man who understood the importance of first impressions and respectful interactions. "Yes, sir. I finished my shift about an hour ago," Marcus said. "But I was hoping I could speak with you for a moment, if that's all right." Tommy nodded, and the two men moved slightly away from the larger group, though they remained within earshot of several people who were clearly interested in witnessing this conversation. "Coach," Marcus began, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of emotion, "I need to explain something about what happened earlier. It's not that I didn't recognize you. I mean, I did, sort of. But I've been working security here for 15 years, and I've learned that sometimes people claim to be someone they're not, or they assume that recognition will get them special treatment." Tommy listened intently, recognizing the importance of allowing Marcus to say what he needed to say. "The thing is," Marcus continued, "when I was growing up, my father used to tell me that the measure of a person isn't how they act when everyone knows who they are, but how they behave when they think no one important is watching." Marcus paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing with increased intensity. "Coach, you stood there for 15 minutes while I questioned your credentials, while I treated you like any other person trying to get into an event, and you never once pulled rank. You never once said, 'Do you know who I am?' You never threatened to have me fired or complained to my supervisor. You just stood there with patience and dignity, treating me with respect even when I was frankly not recognizing who you were." Tommy felt his throat tighten again, struck by the perceptiveness of Marcus's observation. In a world where celebrity and status often led to entitled behavior and special treatment, Marcus had recognized something authentic about the way Tommy had handled an awkward situation. "And then," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger, "when Dr. Hendricks explained who you were, when you had every right to be upset or embarrassed about the whole thing, you took the time to make sure I knew I had done my job correctly. You turned what could have been a humiliating moment for me into a lesson about integrity and doing things the right way. Marcus straightened his shoulders and looked directly into Tommy's eyes with an expression of deep sincerity. Coach, I knelt earlier, not just because you're Auburn royalty, though you certainly are. I knelt because you showed me what real leadership looks like. My father was right. The measure of a person is how they act when they think no one important is watching. But tonight I learned that sometimes the most important person watching is yourself. The main dining area of the Auburn Alumni Center had been arranged to accommodate nearly 300 guests, with Tommy's table positioned prominently near the front of the room, just below the raised platform where the evening speakers would address the gathered crowd. The dinner service was in full swing, with the pleasant clatter of silverware against china providing a comfortable background rhythm to the dozens of conversations taking place simultaneously throughout the space. Tommy found himself seated at what was clearly designated as the head table, surrounded by university administrators, distinguished alumni, and other honorees for the evening. To his left sat Dr. Margaret Foster, Auburn's president, a woman whose academic credentials were matched by her genuine passion for the university and its mission. To his right was Judge William Harrison, a 1978 Auburn graduate who now served on the Alabama Supreme Court and had been selected as the evening's keynote speaker. Despite the honor of his prominent seating arrangement, Tommy found his attention frequently drifting back to Marcus, who had been invited to remain for the dinner portion of the evening at Dr. Hendricks's insistence. The security guard was seated at a table with other university staff members, but Tommy could see him engaging in animated conversation with his tablemates, his face lit up with the kind of genuine enjoyment that comes from being in the company of people who truly appreciate your presence. Tommy, Dr. Foster said, leaning toward him as the salad course was being cleared away. I hope you don't mind me asking, but I've been hearing some interesting stories about what happened at the entrance earlier tonight. Patricia mentioned that one of our security staff members didn't immediately recognize you. Tommy smiled, appreciating the diplomatic way she had phrased the question. That's right. And I have to tell you, Margaret, it was one of the most refreshing interactions I've had in quite a while. Marcus, that's the security officer, treated me exactly the same way he would treat anyone else trying to enter your event. No special privileges, no shortcuts, just consistent professionalism. Judge Harrison, who had been listening to their conversation while working on his dinner, turned toward them with obvious interest. In my line of work, I see a lot of people who expect their position or reputation to exempt them from following the same rules as everyone else. It sounds like this Marcus fellow understands something important about equality under the law, so to speak. That's exactly right, Tommy said, warming to the subject. You know, in all my years of coaching, I tried to teach my players that character is what you do when no one is watching, when there's no crowd cheering, when there's no immediate reward for doing the right thing. But tonight, I learned something from Marcus about a different kind of character, the courage to treat everyone the same, regardless of their status or your assumptions about who they might be. Dr. Foster nodded thoughtfully. That's actually very much in line with Auburn's values. We talk a lot about the Auburn Creed, about believing in work and honest competition, about being honest and truthful. But sometimes it takes someone from outside our immediate circle to remind us what those values look like in practice. As if summoned by their conversation, Dr. Hendricks appeared beside their table, clipboard in hand and wearing the slightly harried expression of someone managing a complex event with multiple moving parts. Coach Tuberville, she said, leaning down slightly to be heard over the ambient noise. I hope everything is going well so far. I wanted to let you know that we've had a slight change to tonight's program. Judge Harrison will still be giving our keynote address, but we'd like to invite you to say a few words as well, if you're comfortable doing so. Tommy glanced around the table, noting the encouraging nods from Dr. Foster and Judge Harrison. Public speaking had been a regular part of his coaching career, from post-game press conferences to donor events to motivational talks for various community organizations. But tonight felt different, weighted with significance in a way he was still trying to understand. "Of course," he said, "I'd be honored. Any particular topic you'd like me to address?" Dr. Hendricks consulted her notes briefly before responding. "Well, the theme of tonight's event is Auburn Legends Past, Present and Future. We were hoping you might speak about what Auburn means to you, and maybe what you see as the university's role in shaping future leaders." Tommy nodded his agreement, but his mind was already working on something more specific, something connected to the evening's unexpected beginning and the lessons he was still processing from his interaction with Marcus. As the dinner service concluded and the program portion of the evening began, Tommy found himself studying the faces in the audience. The gathering represented a cross-section of Auburn's extended family: students and alumni, faculty and staff, community leaders and longtime supporters. Each person had their own Auburn story, their own set of experiences and memories connected to this place and what it represented. Judge Harrison's keynote address was eloquent and inspiring, focusing on the ways in which Auburn had prepared him for a career in public service and the importance of maintaining institutional values in an era of rapid change. His words were well received, earning several rounds of applause and the kind of attentive silence that indicated genuine engagement from the audience. As Judge Harrison concluded his remarks and returned to his seat, Dr. Foster approached the podium to introduce Tommy. The room's energy shifted subtly, the way it does when people sense they're about to hear from someone whose words might carry particular weight or meaning. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Foster began, her voice carrying easily through the room's sound system, "it gives me great pleasure to introduce someone who needs very little introduction to this audience. Coach Tommy Tuberville led Auburn football to some of its most memorable victories, including an undefeated season that will forever be remembered as one of the greatest achievements in college football history." The applause was immediate and sustained, building as people rose to their feet in recognition of Tommy's contributions to Auburn's athletic legacy. Tommy acknowledged the ovation with characteristic humility, waiting for the applause to subside before beginning his remarks. But rather than launching into the kind of prepared speech that might be expected on such an occasion, Tommy began with something more personal and immediate. "Thank you for that warm welcome," he said, his voice settling into the comfortable cadence of someone accustomed to addressing groups. "You know, I came here tonight expecting to participate in a celebration of Auburn's past achievements and future potential. What I didn't expect was to receive one of the most important lessons I've learned in years, and that lesson came from someone who probably doesn't realize the impact he had." Tommy paused, scanning the audience until his eyes found Marcus, who was sitting straighter in his chair, clearly surprised to find himself the apparent subject of the coach's opening remarks. "Earlier this evening, I had the privilege of meeting Marcus Washington, one of Auburn's security officers. Now, I use the word privilege very deliberately, because what happened between Marcus and me tonight reminded me of something fundamental about what Auburn really represents. The room had grown completely quiet, with the kind of focused attention that comes when an audience senses they're about to hear something unexpected and meaningful. You see, when I arrived at the entrance to tonight's event, Marcus asked to see my invitation and identification. When I couldn't produce the proper paperwork, he politely but firmly informed me that I couldn't enter. Now, I have to admit, for just a moment, I was tempted to pull what we might call the coach card, to say, "Don't you know who I am?" and expect special treatment based on my past association with this university. Tommy glanced toward Marcus again, noting the man's obvious discomfort at being the center of attention, but also seeing something else, a kind of quiet pride in the way he was holding himself. But something about Marcus's demeanor, his professionalism, his genuine commitment to doing his job correctly, stopped me from taking that easy path. Instead, I found myself respecting the fact that he was treating me exactly the same way he would treat anyone else trying to enter this event. No special privileges, no shortcuts, just consistent application of the rules. Dr. Foster, sitting at the head table, exchanged a meaningful glance with Judge Harrison, both of them recognizing that Tommy was using this personal anecdote to illustrate something larger about character and institutional values. Now, when the mix-up was eventually resolved and my identity was confirmed, I watched carefully to see how Marcus would respond. Would he be embarrassed? Would he be defensive? Would he try to explain away what had happened? Tommy's voice took on the tone of someone building toward an important point, the same intensity he had once brought to halftime speeches when his team needed to understand something crucial about their situation. Instead, Marcus did something that absolutely stunned me. He acknowledged his initial confusion, but then he did something even more remarkable. He took a knee. Not because I demanded it, not because anyone told him to, but because he recognized in that moment what real leadership looks like. A murmur went through the audience as people began to understand the significance of what Tommy was describing. The image of a security guard kneeling in respect for a coach was powerful enough, but the context Tommy was providing made it something much deeper. You see, Marcus didn't kneel because I'm a former football coach, though I appreciate the respect that implies. He knelt because he recognized something that I think we sometimes forget in our celebrity-obsessed culture, that true leadership isn't about demanding recognition or special treatment. It's about how you conduct yourself when no one knows who you are, when there's no immediate benefit to doing the right thing, when integrity is its own reward. Tommy paused to take a sip of water, using the brief silence to let his words sink in with the audience. He could see that people were engaged, leaning forward slightly in their chairs, waiting to see where he was taking this story. Marcus taught me something tonight about what Auburn really means. It's not just about the victories we've achieved on the football field, though those are certainly important and meaningful. It's not just about the academic excellence we've pursued, though that's absolutely central to our mission. Auburn is about the kind of character we develop in our people, students, faculty, staff, and alumni, and the way that character expresses itself in everyday interactions. Marcus was now clearly uncomfortable with the attention, but Tommy could see that the man was also deeply moved by the recognition. Other people at Marcus's table were patting him on the back and offering quiet words of encouragement, clearly proud to be associated with someone who was being honored in this way. I've been privileged to coach some outstanding young men during my time at Auburn, players who went on to have successful careers in professional football and in many other fields. I've watched them develop into leaders in their communities, devoted fathers, successful businessmen, and public servants. But what Marcus showed me tonight is that Auburn's impact extends far beyond the people who play sports or earn degrees here. Tommy's voice grew stronger as he approached the central theme of his impromptu speech. Auburn's real legacy is in the Marcus Washingtons of the world, the people who do their jobs with integrity and dignity, who treat everyone with respect regardless of their status, who understand that true service means being consistent in your principles, even when it would be easier to make exceptions. The applause that began to build at this point was different from the polite recognition Tommy had received when he was introduced. This was the sound of people responding to something that had touched them personally, something that connected with their own experiences and values. So, when we talk about Auburn legends, when we celebrate the past and look toward the future, I hope we'll remember that legends aren't just made in stadiums or classrooms or laboratories. They're made in everyday moments, in routine interactions, in the choices we make when we think no one important is watching. Tommy gestured toward Marcus, who was now clearly fighting back tears, as the audience began to turn toward him with obvious appreciation and respect. "Marcus, would you please stand up?" The security guard looked around uncertainly, clearly not comfortable with being the center of attention in such a formal setting. But encouraged by his tablemates and responding to the genuine warmth in Tommy's voice, he slowly rose to his feet. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tommy said, his voice carrying across the now silent room, "I present to you a true Auburn legend, a man who reminded me tonight what this university is really about." The standing ovation that followed was immediate and heartfelt, with the entire audience rising to their feet to applaud a man most of them had never heard of before tonight. Marcus stood there, clearly overwhelmed by the recognition, his face reflecting a mixture of embarrassment, pride, and deep emotion. As the applause continued, Tommy stepped away from the podium and began walking toward Marcus's table. The symbolism was not lost on anyone in the room. The honored guest, the celebrated coach, the featured speaker, was leaving his position of prominence to personally acknowledge someone whose only claim to fame was doing his job with integrity and dignity. When Tommy reached Marcus, the two men embraced, not the formal handshake of public acquaintances, but the genuine embrace of two people who had recognized something important in each other. The audience continued its applause, many people now openly emotional as they witnessed this unexpected display of mutual respect and recognition. "Marcus," Tommy said, his voice now audible only to those immediately around them, "thank you for reminding me what Auburn is really about. Thank you for doing your job the right way, every time, regardless of who's watching." Marcus struggled to find words adequate to express what he was feeling. "Coach," he finally managed, "thank you for seeing something in a simple security guard that I didn't even know was there." "There's nothing simple about what you do," Tommy replied firmly, "and there's nothing simple about the way you do it. You represent the best of what Auburn stands for." "Day," as the two men separated and Tommy made his way back toward the podium to conclude his remarks, the energy in the room had shifted dramatically. What had begun as a formal celebration of institutional achievement had become something more personal and immediate. A recognition that Auburn's true strength lay not in its famous alumni or celebrated victories, but in the everyday character of the people who made up its extended family. "I came here tonight to talk about Auburn legends," Tommy said, returning to the microphone. "And I discovered that sometimes legends are standing right in front of us, doing their jobs with quiet dignity, treating everyone with respect, and reminding us what real leadership looks like." He paused one final time, looking out over an audience that was clearly moved by what they had witnessed. "That's the Auburn I'm proud to be associated with. That's the Auburn that will continue to produce leaders, not just for Alabama or the South, but for the entire world. And that's the Auburn that Marcus Washington represents every single day." The reception area adjacent to the main dining room had been transformed into an informal gathering space where guests could continue their conversations over coffee, dessert, and the kind of relaxed socializing that often produces the most meaningful connections at events like these. The lighting was softer here, creating an atmosphere that encouraged lingering and deeper conversation. Tommy found himself at the center of multiple ongoing discussions, but his attention kept returning to Marcus, who was surrounded by his own growing circle of admirers. Word of the security guard's recognition during Tommy's speech had spread quickly, and people were eager to meet the man who had inspired such eloquent praise from a legendary coach. Dr. Sarah Chen, the development officer who had shared her story earlier in the evening, approached Tommy with a thoughtful expression and a cup of coffee in each hand. "Coach," she said, offering him one of the cups, "I wanted to thank you for what you said about Marcus tonight, But I also wanted to tell you that what happened out there, the way you handled that situation, the way you recognized his character, that's going to have an impact far beyond this room." Tommy accepted the coffee gratefully, noting the careful way Sarah had prepared it, black, just the way he preferred, suggesting she had been paying attention to details throughout the evening. "How do you mean?" he asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. Sarah gestured toward Marcus, who was engaged in animated conversation with a group that included several students, some university staff members, and at least 2 people who appeared to be local business leaders. "Look at what's happening over there," she said. "Those students are talking to Marcus like he's someone important, someone worth listening to. Before tonight, they probably never would have given a security guard a second thought. But because you took the time to recognize the value of what he does, they're seeing him differently." Tommy followed her gaze, studying the dynamics of the conversation around Marcus. She was right. The body language, the attentiveness, the obvious respect being shown to the security guard represented a significant shift from how such interactions typically unfolded. "One of those students is Jake Morrison," Sarah continued. "He's a junior studying business, comes from a pretty wealthy family in Birmingham. 6 months ago, he was involved in an incident where he tried to get into a restricted area of the library by name-dropping his father's donations to the university. The staff member he was talking to, a woman named Mrs. Patterson, who's worked here for 20 years, politely but firmly told him that the rules applied to everyone equally." Tommy was beginning to see where this story was headed, and he felt a familiar sense of recognition, the way certain patterns of behavior repeated themselves across different contexts and situations. "Jake threw what I can only describe as a tantrum," Sarah said, her voice carrying a mixture of disappointment and concern. "He demanded to speak to supervisors, threatened to have Mrs. Patterson fired, basically did everything you didn't do tonight when Marcus questioned your credentials." "And now?" Tommy asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Now he's over there listening to Marcus talk about the importance of treating everyone with respect, about how doing your job with integrity matters more than who your parents are or how much money your family has donated to the university," Sarah said with obvious satisfaction. "Sometimes it takes seeing authentic leadership in action to understand what you've been missing." As they talked, Tommy became aware of someone approaching from his peripheral vision. He turned to see Marcus walking toward them, his expression serious but not troubled, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had received important recognition and was still processing what it meant. "Coach," Marcus said, "I hope I'm not interrupting, but I was wondering if I could speak with you privately for a moment." Sarah immediately excused herself with the grace of someone who understood when her presence was no longer needed, leaving the 2 men to find a quieter corner of the reception area where they could talk without being overheard. "Marcus," Tommy said once they were settled, "I hope you weren't uncomfortable with the attention tonight. I know that kind of public recognition can be overwhelming, especially when you're not expecting it." Marcus shook his head, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "No, sir, I wasn't uncomfortable. Surprised, certainly. Honored, absolutely. But not uncomfortable. What I wanted to talk to you about was something different." Tommy waited patiently, recognizing the careful way Marcus was choosing his words and respecting the importance of whatever the man was working up to saying. "Coach, what you said tonight about how I treated you at the entrance, about doing my job the same way regardless of who I was dealing with, that's something I learned from my father, but it's also something I learned from you." Tommy's eyebrows raised in curiosity. "From me? But we'd never met before tonight." "Not directly," Marcus said, settling into his explanation with the careful pace of someone telling a story that mattered deeply to him. "But I've been working security at Auburn events for 15 years, and in that time, I've watched how different people, famous people, important people, wealthy people, interact with staff members like me. Marcus paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing with increased intensity. Most of the time, people in your position don't even see security guards. We're just part of the background, invisible unless something goes wrong. But over the years, I noticed that you were different. When you came to events, you always acknowledged the staff. You learned people's names. You treated everyone like they mattered. Tommy felt a flush of warmth at the recognition, but also a slight embarrassment. He had never consciously thought about his interactions with support staff as being anything special. It had simply seemed like the natural way to treat people. I remember one night in particular, Marcus continued. It was about 3 years ago, during a donor event in the football facility. There was a catering worker, a young woman, probably a student working part-time, who accidentally spilled a tray of appetizers near where you were talking with some major donors. The memory was coming back to Tommy now, though it had been filed away in his mind as just another routine interaction rather than something significant. She was mortified, clearly expecting to be yelled at or reported to her supervisor, Marcus said. Instead, you immediately got down and helped her clean up the mess. You made sure she wasn't hurt, asked her name, and then spent a few minutes talking to her about her studies while the cleanup crew finished their work. Tommy nodded, remembering the incident more clearly now. The young woman had been studying education, he recalled, hoping to become a teacher after graduation. What you probably didn't know, Marcus continued, is that some of those donors were complaining about the interruption, suggesting that the catering staff was unprofessional and that someone should be disciplined for the accident. You heard those comments, and you made it very clear, politely but firmly, that accidents happen, that the young woman had handled the situation professionally, and that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity. Marcus looked directly into Tommy's eyes, his expression intense with the weight of what he was trying to communicate. Coach, that night, I watched you demonstrate exactly the kind of leadership you talked about in your speech tonight. You showed that how you treat people when you don't have to, when there's no immediate benefit to being kind, when no one would blame you for just walking away. That's what defines your character. Tommy felt his throat tighten with emotion. The incident Marcus was describing had seemed so minor at the time, just a simple matter of helping someone who needed assistance and ensuring they were treated fairly. He had never imagined that anyone was paying particular attention to his response, much less that it would have a lasting impact. So when you stood at my security checkpoint tonight, Marcus continued, when you could have pulled rank or demanded special treatment, when you instead showed patience and respect for the process I was trying to follow, that wasn't a surprise to me. That was exactly consistent with the kind of person I've observed you to be over the years. Marcus straightened his shoulders, his voice taking on the formal tone of someone making an important declaration. Coach, when I knelt tonight, it wasn't just about recognizing your football achievements or your status as Auburn royalty. It was about recognizing the consistency of character you've shown over years of interactions when you thought no one important was watching. The two men stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both processing the weight of what had been shared. Tommy was struck by the realization that his casual interactions over the years, moments he had thought of as routine courtesy, had been observed and evaluated by people whose opinion he had never thought to consider. Marcus, Tommy said finally, thank you for telling me that story. It reminds me that we're all being watched, not by people looking to catch us doing something wrong, but by people who are looking for examples of how to live, how to treat others, how to be better than we were yesterday. As they talked, both men became aware that they were being observed by others in the reception area, not in an intrusive way, but with the kind of respectful attention that people pay when they recognize they're witnessing something meaningful. Among those watching was Jake Morrison, the student Sarah had mentioned earlier. He had positioned himself within earshot of their conversation, clearly hoping to learn something from the interaction between the legendary coach and the security guard who had earned such unexpected recognition. "Excuse me," Jake said, approaching with the slightly hesitant manner of someone who wasn't entirely sure they had the right to interrupt. "Coach Tuberville, Mr. Washington. I'm sorry to bother you, but I was hoping I could ask you something." Tommy and Marcus both turned toward the young man, their expressions open and welcoming despite the interruption of their private conversation. "Of course," Tommy said. "What's on your mind?" Jake glanced nervously between the two men before focusing his attention primarily on Marcus. "Mr. Washington, earlier tonight you were talking about how treating everyone with respect isn't just about being polite. You said it was about recognizing that every person has value and dignity, regardless of their job or their status." Marcus nodded, encouraging Jake to continue with his question. "I guess what I'm asking is, how do you learn to see people that way? How do you get past your own assumptions and prejudices and really see the person in front of you?" The question hung in the air with the weight of genuine seeking, and both Tommy and Marcus recognized that this young man was asking something that went far beyond polite curiosity. Marcus looked at Tommy, silently asking if he should take the lead in responding. Tommy nodded encouragingly, recognizing that Marcus was better positioned to address this particular question. "Jake," Marcus said, using the young man's name with the same careful attention Tommy had always shown to learning and using people's names. "The honest answer is that it's something you have to practice, something you have to work at every day." Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully as he prepared to share something personal and potentially vulnerable. "When I first started working security here, I made a lot of assumptions about people based on their appearance, their age, the way they dressed, the way they talked. I thought I could tell who was important and who wasn't, who deserved my attention and who was just taking up my time." Jake listened intently, clearly recognizing something of his own experience in Marcus's confession. "But over the years, I learned that those assumptions were usually wrong, and more importantly, they were preventing me from seeing the real person standing in front of me." Marcus continued. "The breakthrough came when I started asking myself a simple question every time I met someone new. What can I learn from this person? Instead of trying to figure out how they fit into my preconceived categories, I started trying to understand what they had to teach me." "Udum." Tommy found himself nodding in agreement, recognizing the wisdom in Marcus's approach and thinking about how it connected to his own experiences as a coach working with young people from diverse backgrounds. "It's like what Coach Tuberville demonstrated tonight," Marcus said, gesturing toward Tommy. "When I questioned his credentials at the entrance, he could have seen me as an obstacle to overcome or a problem to solve. Instead, he saw me as a person doing my job, someone worthy of respect and patience, even when I was making his evening more complicated." Jake's expression suggested that Marcus's words were resonating deeply, connecting with something the young man had been struggling to understand about his own interactions with others. "The thing is," Marcus continued, "once you start really seeing people, really paying attention to who they are rather than just what role they're playing in your life, you realize that everyone has something valuable to offer. Everyone has a story worth hearing, experiences worth learning from, perspectives that can teach you something about yourself and the world." 3 months after the Auburn Legends Gala, the impact of that evening's events continued to ripple through the university community and beyond. The story of Tommy Tuberville's gracious response to being questioned by security and Marcus Washington's subsequent recognition had spread far beyond those who had been present in the Alumni Center that October night. Marcus found himself in an unfamiliar position as he walked across the Auburn campus on a crisp January morning. Students greeted him by name, faculty members stopped to chat, and he had been invited to speak at 3 different student organization meetings about leadership and character. The attention was still somewhat overwhelming, but he was beginning to understand that his story had become something larger than his personal experience. He was heading to a meeting that would have seemed impossible just a few months earlier, a breakfast with Dr. Foster, the university president, and several other administrators to discuss his ideas for a new campus program focused on recognizing and celebrating the contributions of all university employees, regardless of their position or visibility. The invitation had come as a direct result of the conversations that had begun on the night of the gala. Multiple people had approached Marcus in the weeks following the event, sharing their own stories of university employees who went above and beyond in their daily work, but rarely received recognition for their contributions. As Marcus approached the president's office in Samford Hall, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since that October evening. Not in terms of his basic circumstances, he was still working the same security job, still living in the same modest apartment in Opelika, still driving the same 10-year-old pickup truck. But something fundamental had shifted in how he saw himself and how others saw him. The meeting itself was both professional and warm, with Dr. Foster and her team genuinely interested in Marcus's proposal for what he had tentatively named the Everyday Excellence Initiative. The program would create formal opportunities to recognize staff members across all departments who exemplified Auburn values in their daily work, with nominations coming from students, faculty, and fellow employees. "Marcus," Dr. Foster said as the meeting concluded, "I want you to know that this initiative represents exactly the kind of forward-thinking approach Auburn needs. You've identified something important about institutional culture that we might have overlooked otherwise." As Marcus left the administration building, he noticed a familiar figure waiting near the front steps. Tommy Tuberville stood in the morning sunshine, dressed casually in Auburn gear, looking every bit like a former coach who had maintained his connection to the university. "Marcus," Tommy called out with a genuine smile, "I was hoping I might catch you here. Do you have a few minutes to walk?" The two men set off across the campus together, their conversation easy and natural despite the difference in their backgrounds and the unusual circumstances that had brought them together. Over the past 3 months, they had maintained regular contact, with Tommy often seeking Marcus's perspective on various community issues, and Marcus finding in Tommy a mentor who understood the complexities of leadership in both formal and informal settings. "I heard about your meeting with Dr. Foster," Tommy said as they walked past the student center. "How did it go?" Marcus smiled, still somewhat amazed that his ideas were being taken seriously at the highest levels of university administration. "Better than I expected, honestly. They're moving forward with the Everyday Excellence Initiative, and they want me to help coordinate the first year of the program." Tommy's expression showed genuine pleasure at this news. "That's outstanding, Marcus. You've identified something that needed to be addressed, and now you're in a position to do something about it. That's real leadership." As they continued their walk, they encountered several students who recognized both men and stopped to chat. The interactions were telling in their naturalness. Students treating Marcus with the same respect and attention they showed to Tommy, asking both men about their work and their perspectives on various campus issues. "You know," Tommy said after one particularly engaged conversation with a group of sophomore students, "I've been thinking a lot about that night at the gala, about what we both learned from that experience." Marcus nodded, encouraging Tommy to continue with his thoughts. "I've realized that what happened between us wasn't really about me learning to appreciate how you do your job, or you learning to recognize my contributions to Auburn," Tommy said, his voice taking on the reflective tone of someone working through complex ideas. "It was about both of us discovering something important about what authentic leadership looks like." They had reached the area near Jordan-Hare Stadium, the site where their first encounter had taken place. Both men paused, looking toward the entrance where Marcus had been stationed that October evening. "I spent 30 years coaching, teaching young men about character and integrity and doing things the right way," Tommy continued. "But I think I sometimes got caught up in the formal aspects of leadership, the speeches, the recognition, the public demonstrations of values. What you showed me that night is that real leadership often happens in quiet moments, in routine interactions, in the consistency of how you treat people when no one is watching." Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his throat that came whenever Tommy spoke about the impact of their encounter. Despite all the recognition and attention that had followed, he still sometimes struggled to believe that his simple commitment to doing his job correctly had resonated so deeply with others. "Coach," Marcus said, "I think what you're describing goes both ways. I learned something that night too, about grace under pressure, about how to handle unexpected situations with dignity, about the importance of treating setbacks as opportunities to demonstrate character." As they stood there, both men became aware of a small group of people approaching from the direction of the campus center. Leading the group was Sarah Chen, the development officer who had shared her story at the gala, along with several other university employees and what appeared to be a few prospective students and their families. "Coach Tuberville, Mr. Washington," Sarah called out as the group drew near. "Perfect timing. I was just giving these prospective students and their families a tour of campus, and I was hoping to tell them about what happened here a few months ago." Odin, Tommy and Marcus exchanged glances, both somewhat amused by the way their chance encounter had apparently become part of the unofficial Auburn tour. "Would you mind sharing the story?" Sarah asked. "I think it illustrates something important about Auburn's values that these families should hear." What followed was a collaborative retelling of the events of that October evening, with both Tommy and Marcus contributing their perspectives on what had happened and what they had learned from the experience. The prospective students and their parents listened intently, clearly engaged by the authenticity of the story and the obvious mutual respect between the two men telling it. One of the parents, a woman from Mobile, whose son was considering Auburn for his engineering studies, raised her hand with a question. "Mr. Washington," she said, "what you're describing, this commitment to treating everyone the same regardless of their status, is that something you see consistently across the university?" Marcus considered the question carefully before responding, appreciating the genuine concern behind it. "Ma'am, I'd be lying if I said Auburn was perfect or that every interaction here reflects the highest possible standards," he said honestly. "But what I can tell you is that Auburn has a culture that rewards and recognizes people who try to live up to these values, and that when someone falls short, there are systems in place to address those situations." He gestured toward Tommy before continuing. "What happened between Coach Tuberville and me that night wasn't unusual because of how I acted. Doing my job correctly should be the expectation, not the exception. What was remarkable was how he responded when things didn't go smoothly, and how the university community embraced both of us afterward." Tommy nodded in agreement. "Auburn's strength isn't that everyone here is perfect. It's that the institution supports and celebrates people who are trying to do the right thing, even when it's difficult or inconvenient." As the tour group continued on their way, Tommy and Marcus resumed their walk, both reflecting on how their story had evolved from a personal experience into something that was being used to illustrate Auburn's institutional character. "You know," Marcus said as they approached the area where he would need to report for his afternoon shift, "I keep thinking about that young man, Jake Morrison, the one who asked us about learning to see people differently." Tommy remembered the conversation, and particularly the genuine seeking in the young man's question. "I've been watching him around campus since that night," Marcus continued. "He's made a real effort to change how he interacts with people." He volunteers with the maintenance crew during campus cleanup days. He's learned the names of the dining hall workers, and I heard he's been tutoring other students who are struggling academically. Tommy smiled at this update, recognizing it as evidence that their story was having the kind of impact they had hoped for when they decided to share it publicly. "That's the thing about authentic leadership," Tommy said. "It's contagious. When people see someone genuinely trying to live according to their values, it inspires them to examine their own behavior and make changes." As they prepared to part ways, with Marcus heading to his security post and Tommy continuing his walk around campus, both men felt the satisfaction that comes from knowing they had been part of something meaningful and lasting. "Marcus," Tommy said, extending his hand for what had become their customary farewell handshake, "thank you again for that night in October. Thank you for doing your job the right way, for teaching me something important about character, and for showing this community what authentic leadership looks like." Marcus gripped Tommy's hand firmly, looking directly into his eyes with the confidence of someone who had found his voice and his purpose. "Thank you, Coach, for seeing something in a security guard that he didn't even know was there, and for helping me understand that leadership isn't about your title or your position. It's about how you choose to treat people every single day." Lee, as Tommy walked away across the Auburn campus, he found himself thinking about the unexpected directions life could take, about the ways in which routine encounters could become defining moments, and about the power of recognizing and celebrating character wherever it appeared. The story that had begun with a simple misunderstanding at a security checkpoint had evolved into something much larger. A reminder that Auburn's true strength lay not in its famous alumni or celebrated victories, but in the everyday character of the people who made up its extended family. And in a world that often seemed to reward celebrity over character, that message felt more important than ever. Marcus, meanwhile, prepared for another shift of security work, with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that his job was about much more than checking credentials and enforcing rules. He was part of something larger, a community committed to treating all its members with dignity and respect, and he had found his role in helping that community live up to its highest aspirations. The legacy of that October evening would continue to ripple outward, touching lives and inspiring changes in ways that neither Tommy nor Marcus could fully anticipate. But both men understood that they had been part of something authentic and meaningful, something that represented the best of what Auburn could be when its people chose to live according to its highest values. And in the end, perhaps that was the most important lesson of all, that legends aren't just made in stadiums or classrooms, but in everyday moments when ordinary people choose to do extraordinary things, when character matters more than convenience, and when the measure of a person is found not in their title or their achievements, but in how they treat others when they think no one important is watching. As the sun set over the Auburn campus that January evening, both men carried with them the knowledge that they had helped create something lasting, not just a story worth telling, but a standard worth living up to. A reminder that true leadership begins with the simple decision to treat every person you encounter with dignity, respect, and the recognition that everyone has something valuable to contribute to the world.